This is Zestology. I'm Tony Wrighton, and it's the podcast all about energy, vitality and motivation, focusing on topics that help you live with more energy. Today, all the questions you ever wanted answered about sleep, why we sleep, what you should do in the hour before bed to kind of get the best out of your sleep, the perils of bad sleep, how to deal with insomnia, sleep tips for parents, the importance of bright light reduction when it comes to the evening when you start to kind of wind down, the truth about sunglasses, and getting the temperature right in your bedroom as well. My guest is a man I've been following for ages. I read his book, Why We Sleep. Matt Walker, one of the world's, or perhaps you might even say the world's foremost sleep researcher, was in London recently, and I went to meet him at his Airbnb and record this podcast. It was a perfect chance to talk to him about his own sleep schedule, as well as look at all these other really kind of important sleep issues and basically improve our sleep. And the man just knows so much about the activity that we do for a third of our lives. Well, at least we should do. Here he is, Matt Walker, on sleep on Zestology. We're in your Airbnb at the moment, and you said that Tiger across the road was blasting music until 4 a.m. With all your sleep knowledge, how did that make you feel?
Yeah, it was somewhat of an irony that the sleep researcher, ends up in a place where it's kind of counter to everything that is getting a full night of slumber. But I think when you're starting to struggle with sleep at night, and I usually am a pretty good sleeper, and I regiment my sleep and I hopefully know the things to do. But when it's a bad night, I think the key thing is not to get too stressed. I'm sure we'll probably speak about all of the desperate ills and the harmful effects of a lack of sleep, and there are plenty. Yeah. But it's also just don't get too stressed about it. It's going to be a bad night. That's okay. We'll get back into set the next night. It will be fine. I've got some earplugs now. Close the windows. I'll be fine.
Right, okay. I mean, it's easier said than done, isn't it? But,
yeah.
So obviously you're on the road at the moment. You're doing this presentation in London tonight, which I'm coming to, which I'm really looking forward to. And what's the kind of on-the-road sleep regime? You said you've got some earplugs.
Yeah,
what
face
else?
mask.
Face mask, yeah. They're a face mask or just eyes?
Well, it's sort of... It's mostly eyes, but it's sort of one of those that tucks under the bridge of the nose and really tries to seal out. So, darkness. And then when I'm traveling, especially sort of when I come back home to the UK, I usually will use melatonin strategically about an hour before bed, just to sort of help my body listen to a slightly different circadian rhythm than the one that it wants to drum out, which is because I am 8 hours behind in terms of my timing. So usually those are the things that I'll sort of keep to hand.
Okay. No blue blockers in the luggage?
I don't, but I typically stay away from screens in the last hour before bed, and then I will dim down half of the lights wherever I am. And it's a good hack, actually, because, I think people would be surprised at how soporific low light is. It's one of the reasons that, if you go camping and there's very little electric light, you typically start to drift towards an earlier and earlier bedtime. And most people think, well, it's just because there's not much to do. There's no Netflix, there's no kind of BBC iPlayer to watch. Yes, there's probably some of that, but it's also the fact that you're getting a huge darkness signal that you wouldn't get otherwise. And in this modern era, we are a dark, deprived society. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have sleep problems. And I don't say that without science. There was a great study where they looked at people who had done iPad reading for 1 hour before bed versus just reading a normal book in dim light. And there were 3 critical findings. The first was that the iPad actually decreased the amount of melatonin. Excuse the siren.
Don't worry about it.
So the iPad actually decreased the amount of melatonin release, this critical hormone of darkness that helps regulate the healthy timing of sleep. Decreased that by 50%, 50. So it slashed your melatonin release in half.
God, for the whole night? Or?
For the whole night, yeah.
Yeah.
The second was that it delayed the onset of the peak of that melatonin by about 3 hours. So you're probably much closer to, being in sort of Prague time than you are, sort of London time at that stage. the final thing was that it actually disrupted REM sleep as well. And what they also found when they asked people the next morning, how refreshed do you feel? How restored by your sleep do you feel? And after 1 hour of iPad reading before bed, people felt consistently less refreshed by their sleep. And what was even more fascinating was that they tracked them. And after they stopped using the iPad, the effect still had a blast radius for about 2 or 3 days afterwards.
No way.
So there's this dose response that it's almost like taking a drug, that it takes some days to clear out your system. So this is just 1 hour of iPad reading. So you can imagine the effects of nightly computer work on your sleep and your disrupted sleep.
That's absolutely insane, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because they have the night mode. Is it called night shift? Night shift.
Yeah.
But I don't think it blocks out enough blue light, night shift. Because if I compare it to, there's another one called F-Lux, I'm sure you know about it, you can get it for your computer. That will make my screen really quite red.
It will desaturate the blue light from the screen, and it's the blue light that's most harmful. Do those pieces of software have an effect? No one's really done the studies yet to actually see if they're efficacious or not. But it does bring up an interesting question, which is, why blue light? Why is it blue light specifically that's the most harmful? Well, firstly, any light in the evening is going to damage the release of melatonin. It's going to stamp the brakes on it and prevent it from being released. But it is blue light that's most harmful. We are most sensitive to blue light. The reason is an evolutionary explanation. Where we evolved was not on the land, but in the sea. We evolved in the ocean. That's where we came from. And water acts like a filter of light. And that's why the ocean is typically blue. You know, if you're in the sort of the ocean and sort of you see it, it's a blue color. Why? Because it refracts out the yellows and the reds and leaves you with blue. So where we evolved to gain our light signal was in the ocean. And it's in the ocean where we're sort of saturated by blue light. So it's the blue light that we evolved to be most sensitive to get our daily hit of light and our light signal. And then darkness at night, of course. So it's an interesting sort of, evolutionary reason as to why blue is particularly harmful. Yeah,
it is, because I always thought it was kind of in the most of civilization pre-electricity, our eyes have got used to blue light meaning daytime and red light meaning fire and nighttime, but it's even before that.
Yeah, it predates that. Yeah. It's, once we were sort of somewhat unicellular organisms floating around in the ocean.
Because I heard you talk on one interview, I think it was with Rhonda Patrick, about a study that you wished you'd thought of, which was studying lots of people's kind of normal sleep habits and then sending them somewhere with no electricity. And was it Alaska or the Rocky Mountains?
The Rocky Mountains.
Rocky Mountains, yeah. And what happened there?
Yeah, it was a great study. So they took a group of people and they said, what time do you normally go to bed and how much do you normally sleep? And they described, I'd normally go to bed around 11, sort of 10, midnight. There was some variability. And then my sleep need, they said, what's your greatest amount of sleep to feel at your peak, at your optimal amount? And they were sort of saying, probably around 8. And then they just took them off and they took away their phones. They said goodbye to their family and friends. This is it for the next 2 weeks. Shipped them off up camping in the Rocky Mountains in America. And they had no electricity, not even torches, no source of light. And firstly, what they found is quickly they went from being a habitual bedtime of, let's say, 11 o'clock at night to moving back and back towards 10 o'clock and then 9 o'clock. So firstly, where you slept on the 24-hour clock face shifted back because you weren't infected by modernity and electricity and illumination. The second thing was that they didn't just sleep 8 hours, they ended up sleeping closer to 9 hours on average as a group. Which again, I think suggests that this idea that we can survive on 6 hours of sleep, or we were designed to survive on 6 hours of sleep, or that's our natural innate need, is not true. Because when you dislocate human beings from all the vagaries of modernity and you allow their natural sleep to be expressed, they sleep very differently. They don't sleep at the normal time that they do, and they don't sleep the normal duration that they do. They go to bed earlier and they sleep longer.
Yeah. And you were obviously talking about the iPad before. I wonder if there's something not just about technology in terms of the light and the kind of physiological response, but also the intensity of communication. For some reason, I don't know why, but I counted up the number of WhatsApp messages that I had with different people yesterday. I had 27 different conversations, and I wouldn't have thought that's that unusual for people on a daily basis. There's something about that intensity of thought that is very stimulating, and whether it's kind of earlier or later in the day, it's quite hard to come down from that if you're trying to get to sleep as well. So it's not just kind of artificial light, but it's that as well, I wonder.
I think you're right. I think part of the reason that we're seeing such high rates of insomnia and high rates of just sleep disruption and sleep disturbance is in part because of this, faster paced 24/7, MTV fast food generation kind of lifestyle that we're living. And we know that anxiety is one of the principal triggers of insomnia. And I think that's what a lot of these sort of social apps will create. Either it makes you anxious about what you're not doing and what you should be doing, or there's what they call FOMO, which is fear of missing out. And in fact, this is particularly deleterious to teenagers. One study found that teenagers will often sort of sleep with their phones next to them, and they will routinely wake up at least once or twice a night to check their phone, to check social, just to see what's going on, because they have a fear that they miss out on something during the night. And this is frightening.
That's awful, isn't it?
I think one of the other things that technology does in that sense is it causes what we call sleep procrastination, which is actually a real thing, which is that you get into bed, you're tired, you could easily fall asleep, but you've got your phone next to you and you think, oh, I'll just check Facebook one last time. I forgot that post. Oh, I'll just check Twitter. Oh, and I should order that thing from Amazon, so it's here tomorrow. And then you look up and it's 30 minutes later, and now you've shortchanged your sleep by, half an hour. That type of thing can be a real problem too.
Yeah. There are some interesting hacks around that. Have you seen grayscale on the iPhone? You can turn your screen
into black and white. Yeah.
And you can also, in fact, I can show you on my phone now, you can, if you tap it 3 times, the home screen, you can turn it pretty much any colour you like. So when I go to sleep at night, I turn it that, and it's just fully red, and I think it cuts out all the blue light. But again, I don't actually have that measured, so if you could measure it in your lab, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, we actually have light meters that we can, and it gives it the visible spectrum, so we can determine what frequency is it sort of emitting, and
really,
whether all light is going to be harmful, as I mentioned.
Yes,
but certainly taking away that blue light is definitely a good
really
thing.
Yeah. This has probably come at a good time actually, because I've got a 12-week-old baby. So sleep has not been kind of in abundance over the last 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And we kind of tend to switch shifts. So after his feed in the middle of the night, I might kind of get to look after him. And we want to keep him upright for half an hour because that helps with the reflux and so on and so forth. Well, in that half an hour, I want to read my book. And I want, normally I kind of tend to read on the Kindle on my phone. So I will read it, but with that red screen on. Is it better just to leave it and just sit there, do you think?
It's probably better to leave it and read a book normally, or read a magazine, meditate, whatever it is that you want to do. The reason is because sometimes people can't resist the temptation of not just reading a book on their phone, but saying, oh, I wonder if they did respond to that email.
Yeah.
And then that's a trigger, and at that point you're dead in the water for the next 2 hours.
Do you know, and it's so funny because that has been happening a lot. But actually, even though I have heard you talk about this stuff before, and you just said that there, it's still rationally quite hard to explain. Why did X lead to Y? Why did just checking a few messages lead to being awake for 2 hours, or very light sleep when I got back to sleep?
Yeah.
But you've seen it in your research, and it's a real thing.
We have, you speak about that light sleep, and it's an interesting thing. One of the other problems with technology is that even if you're good and you put it into airplane mode throughout the night, usually the first thing that people do when they wake up in the morning is swipe right, and that just unlocks this tsunami wave of the world invading into your eyes and into your brain.
Yeah.
And it's usually things that will trigger stress and anxiety. It's the first emails, it's the sort of the tweet responses. And what that trains your brain to do is expect that worrisome anxiety flooding in when you wake up. It's what we call anticipatory anxiety. So have you ever had the feeling where you had to get up for, let's say, a 7 a.m. flight, and you have to wake up at 5 o'clock? For that night beforehand, your sleep is going to be shallow, it will be fitful, and you'll probably even wake up yourself naturally at 4:58, right before the alarm. Yeah. That essentially is, with the phone being next to you, is a low-grade version, a chronic low-grade version of that same anticipatory anxiety that you have with the flight. It's not as severe, but it's a lower level, but your brain is then trained to expect this hit of, frightening surprise and stress the first thing in the morning. And so as a consequence, you actually have less deep sleep, and we've done these studies, and the more anxious you are about events coming up the next day, the less and less deep sleep that you have the night before. So you are actually going to be diminishing the quality of that sleep by sort of swiping open. So, I'm not trying to be prudish here. I know that the technology genie is out the bottle and it's not going in anytime soon. And I actually think technology is starting to come back around and solve the ills regarding sleep that it caused to begin with. And we see this time and time and again with technology. But what I do think you can try and do is just ask yourself, for 1 week, could I give myself 5 minutes in the morning before I actually unlock my phone? And just do it as an experiment and see. And it's sort of like people with flossing, where they didn't really want to floss their teeth and it was just too much. And they said, for the first week, all you're allowed to do is floss your front 2 teeth, and then that's it. Stop, do no more. And after a while, it actually, you think, well, I could do probably a few more teeth and a few more. And so just grade it and then see if you enjoy 5 minutes, try 10 minutes. And then maybe don't check your phone until after you've had your cup of tea or after you've had your breakfast. And see how far you can go by pushing that boat out. But then critically be a scientist. Do the reverse experiment. In other words, go back to checking your phone first thing in the morning and see how bad that feels. And the reason I suggest doing the negative experiment, as it were, is for 2 reasons. Firstly, you can realize how bad it actually was and be reminded of it. But in second, being reminded of it, when you go back to being good and sort of not checking for the first 10 minutes, but then you have the temptation to fall off the bandwagon, you already have done the experiment. You already know how bad it's going to be. So hopefully it means that you resist the temptation to kind of fall off the wagon.
Yeah, that's excellent advice, and kind of tracking is just so helpful, isn't it? So then you've got a little bit of evidence. We've almost kind of I know in your book that this is kind of almost like the last part of the book. It's the kind of tips for improving. We've leapt forward a bit. Did you kind of, with your background, how did you end up doing what you do now, and how do you describe what you do when you meet someone for the first time?
Well, now I've started to say I'm a dolphin trainer or I'm an accountant, because when you say you're a sleep researcher, people pin you to the wall, and for the next 3 hours you're going to get bombarded with questions, because everyone I've met for the most part is either fascinated by what this thing called sleep is, especially things like dreams, and also what happens when you don't get enough and how can you start to get better sleep. So it seems to be this universal topic of interest by most people. But usually I just tell people I'm a sleep scientist, and I study the good things that happen when you get sleep and the alarmingly bad things that happen when you don't get enough, both for your brain and your body. And we also look at disorders and diseases, things like Alzheimer's disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke. All of these things link to a lack of sleep too.
And do you run, would you call it a laboratory or how do you describe it?
Yeah, so I have what's called the Center for Human Sleep Science at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm the director there. And we do both basic science, but we also do sort of translational clinical science where we work with patients, but we don't actually see patients in a medical sense. We try to sort of see patients to do basic research to see, for example, is a lack of sleep instigating a cascade in the brain that leads to Alzheimer's disease? And we scan their brains and we look at these sticky toxic proteins, things like beta amyloid, and we look at their sleep and how all of those things interact. So we are seeing patients who have Alzheimer's disease, but we're not there as a clinic to actually diagnose sleep problems or treat sleep problems. It's a basic sleep science center.
Yeah, and did you ever think that, because obviously you've been doing that for many years now, haven't you?
Yeah.
Did you ever think you'd kind of be in this position now where it's almost, you've done the research, but people are almost coming to you in terms of a self-help capacity? You've got hundreds of people coming to see you tonight, and not only do they want you to talk about kind of the problems from a lack of sleep, but they want to hear about the solutions as well. That's why I'm sure a lot of them are coming. Did you ever imagine that would be the position that you're in?
I didn't, not with the book. I think it's been a surprise. I wrote the book because I was giving a lot of sort of public speaking events and radio and television, and people would always say to me, could you recommend a book? And I would say,
That question's coming from me later on. I ask everyone on this podcast.
Yeah, and there was...
You didn't know.
But there was just no good book out there. So after about 3 or 4 years, I thought, okay, why don't you just write the book yourself that you would like to read or that you would like to recommend? Fully thinking that I would sell 2 copies, that, my mother and my father would buy the book and that would be it. And it ended up doing, quite well. And that was the first surprise. And then I think after people started to realize what this thing called sleep is and how critically important it is by way of the book and sort of a lot of the public advocacy, then the questions became, okay, I now get it, I understand it, I know sleep is important, but can you tell me how? How can I get better sleep? What do I do to improve my sleep? What are the things that are harming my sleep? What can I change? So I think it's delightfully encouraging to see the how question emerging, which is how can I get better sleep? Because that only emerges after you've understood the importance of why it is that you need to sleep. And the latter cannot come before the former usually. So I think that that's an encouraging sign that the general public is starting to appreciate sleep. I still think sleep, for the most part, is the neglected stepsister in the health conversation of today. I think we have lots of great information on diet and exercise, but sleep has remained in the dark. And it's not a third pillar of good health, by the way. It's the foundation on which those 2 other things sit. And I don't make that statement flippantly, that sleep sort of trumps those 2. Both of those are important. But if you go without food for 24 hours, or you go without exercise for 24 hours, or you go without sleep for 24 hours, and you look at the impact on the brain and the body, which one is most harmful? By a long stretch, it is sleep. By a huge margin, a lack of sleep will take you down in terms of physiological and brain health impairment. We also know, if you're trying to be good on those other things but not getting enough sleep, they're not very effective. So if you're dieting and not getting sufficient sleep, then 70% of all of the weight that you lose will come from muscle mass, and you will hold on and retain your fat. So the body becomes stingy in giving up its fat. It holds on to the thing that you want to get rid of, fat, and it gets rid of the thing that you want to keep, which is muscle, when you're not sleeping. So dieting becomes ineffective when you're not sleeping well.
And you talked about the why. One of the things that I found so interesting reading your book was the frankly fearsome list of consequences of not enough sleep. And you mentioned Alzheimer's as well. If you had to kind of think of 2 or 3 of the worst things from people getting, say, 6 hours sleep instead of 7 or 5 or 4 or whatever it might be, what are the things that you think are most important about getting the sleep that you need to avoid?
The 2 most feared diseases in developed nations are cancer and Alzheimer's disease, and both of them have causal and significant links to a lack of sleep. So, for example, we now know that insufficient sleep is probably the most significant lifestyle factor determining whether or not you will develop Alzheimer's disease. So if you are looking to try to avoid Alzheimer's, but you're getting 6 hours of sleep, then you're not going to accomplish your mission. The second one is cancer. We know that there are strong causal links to a lack of sleep and cancer. Currently, that list includes cancer of the bowel, cancer of the prostate, and cancer of the breast. And in fact, the link between a lack of sleep and cancer is so strong that recently the World Health Organization classified any form of nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen. In other words, jobs that may induce cancer because of a disruption of your sleep-wake rhythms. So I think those 2 things, but then that list doesn't stop. We also know that there are causal links between a lack of sleep and cardiovascular disease, stroke, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and then upstairs in the brain, depression, anxiety, and most recently and tragically, suicide as well. So there is just no single system within your body or operation of your mind that isn't wonderfully enhanced by sleep when you get it, or demonstrably impaired when you don't get enough.
There's a series on BBC Two at the moment on Margaret Thatcher. It's a 5-part documentary on the BBC, and you probably know what I'm going to say next, but it's been kind of widely watched, widely reviewed. Everyone's talking about it, and I think people are frankly astonished at how the legend of her not sleeping very much is something that kind of most people might have heard about. But they show all this footage of, for example, when the Brighton bomb went off, she was up at 3 o'clock working on whatever it was she was working. She really did get 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. Now, in the end, she did develop Alzheimer's, didn't she?
Yeah.
In the meantime, it's amazing to see how sharp she was and how lucid she was on 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. But obviously, she paid for that later on in her life.
Yeah, and that's the thing with a lack of sleep. It can get you acutely or it can get you chronically. So one way that it can pop you out the gene pool very quickly is actually a road traffic accident. We know that sleep is actually essential for your driving ability. A lack of sleep causes more fatalities on our roads than either drugs or alcohol combined. And the reason is because if you have one of these little micro-sleeps at the wheel where your eyelids partially close and you're traveling, let's say, at 60 miles an hour on the motorway, at that point there is a 2-ton missile that is traveling and no one is in charge. And the reason that those sleep-related accidents are usually more deathly than drugs or alcohol, which should be, flagged as horrific things too, is because when you are drunk, you typically respond too late. But when you have a microsleep at the wheel, you don't respond at all. So there's no action versus a late reaction. And that's part of the reason so that's one way that a lack of sleep can pop you, out of that gene pool very quickly, acutely. The other way is chronically, though, through disease and sickness. And it could be that, at age 60, when you think you were trucking along just fine and you were pin sharp mentally and you had no real physical health, at 60 you have a massive coronary heart attack. And we know that data that a lack of sleep leads to calcification of the coronary arteries, which are the main corridors of life for your heart. And that's when people said they had a massive coronary. That's what they mean. The coronary artery blocked and stopped feeding the heart. And we know that a lack of sleep will lead up to a furring up of those arteries that feed the heart. And then even longer still are situations like Alzheimer's disease. The other vocal advocate of how useless and how little sleep they got was Ronald Reagan. He was another head of state in the same era of Margaret Thatcher. Now, we truly don't know. You can see anecdotes where, for example, under extreme conditions, Margaret Thatcher could be awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, but we actually don't really know if she was a short sleeper. I think it probably was part of the chest-beating kind of, sleep machismo, bravado attitude that she would like to portray. But let's just take it as read. Let's assume that she did just sleep 4 or 5 hours a night. Well, it's probably not coincidental that she went on to develop Alzheimer's disease. Now, that's just a sample of one, and you can tell nothing about that. That's just an anecdote. But from the weight of the evidence that we have now, I would simply say that from a scientific perspective, it's not unsurprising that she developed Alzheimer's disease.
And certainly I interviewed Dr. Dale Bredesen, who you might have heard of. He was really interesting, wrote The End of Alzheimer's, which I think was number 1 on all of Amazon for a few days at least.
Yeah.
And his kind of number 1 recommendation is sort the sleep out. And then he's got about 26 others. But
sleep is the tide that raises all other health boats. Sleep it's like the Archimedes lever. It's this superordinate node, and a lot of people are trying to sort of hack their way into improving their blood sugar or doing something with their blood pressure or changing their immune factors and their sort of immune reactivity. Well, what would happen if there was something that sat above all of those as a major control unit, that if you just focused on that and dialed it up, every one of those other things, it's almost like when you see those remarkable music studios where you've got this music deck and you've got all of these dials, and then there's that one dial at the far left end which if you push it, all of the other dials move up. That far left dial, that's sleep, and if you move that up, all of the other levers actually improve, so you don't need to worry. It's the Swiss Army knife of health.
And I know people listening to this are going to be convinced just as I am by listening to you. A couple more kind of practical suggestions. I said I'm a new parent, and I've been kind of wondering at how people who are parents do it. Probably you get asked it a lot, but it's, I'm just not getting as much sleep as I used to, and I'm allocating more time to it. So do you have any tips for how I can get some more sleep?
So, firstly, realize that your young child does not yet have what we call an established circadian rhythm, which is this beautiful 24-hour cycling rhythm that all of our bodies have. And that isn't glued into place, and it doesn't develop for, probably until about 1 year or 18 months. So, at that point, or before that point, your child is just going to be, up and down. They're going to be sleeping, awake, feeding, sleeping, awake, feeding, sleeping. and you're going to have to find a way to deal with it. One of the ways, if you are a family that has, 2 parents, you can try to trade off and find some way to do shift systems. That typically works well. The other one is just to be opportunistic with your sleep. If you can take naps throughout the day, take them whenever you can. Just strategically grab sleep whenever you must. That's not the advice I would give to the general public, though, regarding sleep. Naps are a dangerous double-edged sword. If you are struggling with sleep at night, you should avoid naps during the day. And the reason is because as we're awake during the day, we build up all of this healthy sleepiness in our brain, and there's a chemical that builds up that's called adenosine. The more of it that builds up, the sleepier you feel. After about 16 hours of build-up, you should be plenty enough to then sleep for 8 hours. And when you sleep for 8 hours, you remove all of that sleepiness chemical in the brain and you wake up refreshed, ready for the next day. That's how it works. But if you were to take a nap in the afternoon, especially too late in the afternoon, you release some of that sleepiness, almost like a pressure valve on a cooker, and it just gets rid of some of that sleepiness, so that now when it comes time to get to bed in the evening, you either can't fall asleep as easy or you can't stay asleep. So the advice would be for the general public, if you don't struggle with sleep and you can nap regularly, then naps are just fine. But if you can't nap regularly, and especially if you struggle with sleep at night, you should avoid naps. But if you're a new parent, you should be sleeping whenever you can get it.
And I heard you talk about this concept of kind of being dark deprived and maybe light deprived as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about that and how people might kind of think in those terms about changing their bedtimes and their wake times as well?
So we are, I think, a dark deprived society in this modern era. Sort of, those discussions about the iPad reading or sort of light in the evening and just dimming that down in the last hour before bed. All of those things, that darkness signal, helps encourage the release of this hormone called melatonin. And melatonin helps time the great sleep race, as it were. It's like the starting official at the 100-meter race in the Olympics. It gathers all of the races together and starts the timing of that race. So you need melatonin. So that's why we need a darkness signal at night to help us get to sleep and time the healthy onset of our sleep. But equally, in the daytime, we need light, because light will actually make us more awake throughout the day. And even office light is not particularly strong. It's not even as strong as a very dull day outside. So you need to get outside, especially in the morning. Try to get at least 20 minutes of daylight in the morning. So that way you have a sort of a nice deep trough at night in terms of getting sleepy, and that's melatonin being released, that's darkness, that's putting you down to sleep. And then light during the day means you have a wonderful peak of alertness throughout the day. Because otherwise, if you have too much light at night and not enough light during the day, that sort of that deep trough and that peak, the trough will be shallower, the peak will be shallower. So you're almost just flatlining. So you're never fully asleep at night and you're never fully awake during the day. To push those two as far apart as you can, get lots of darkness at night so you go down to a deep sleep, and get lots of daylight during the day so you're plenty awake throughout that waking period.
And what do you think about sunglasses?
Yeah, so if you go out in the morning and you're trying to get that hit of daylight, which is great, don't wear shades in the morning. I know it looks cool, but you need to get all of that daylight into the brain. If you go out in the afternoon, let's say you want to go out for a long walk or a run in the afternoon, that's fine, but now is the time to put shades on, because you already want to start blocking the light in the late afternoon to start encouraging the release of melatonin into the evening.
Right, yeah. I went to the cricket last week and I spent all day outside, kind of from the morning to the evening. And it's not often, actually, especially when you're working, that you get to do that. And I slept so well afterwards. I'm sure it's because I was outside all day long.
Isn't it surprising? And we've done some of those studies too, where you track, using these wristwatches, the amount of daylight exposure that people have. And that seems to be a good predictor of how well and soundly you're going to be sleeping the night afterwards. So daylight exposure predicts better sleep at night.
Yeah. Carl, let me just check the time. Oh yeah, we're good for time. You're okay for time?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, good.
Now I've got a family member who's gone through or just going through the menopause at the moment, and their sleep's got a lot worse.
Yeah.
And they said, "Could you ask?" So here I am asking about how the menopause might affect sleep.
It's very difficult. We know it affects it, mostly because of temperature changes in the body at night. A lot of women, as they're going through menopause, will complain about the night sweats and sort of just getting too hot, these hot flashes at night. And one of the problems with that is you need to drop your core body temperature by about 1 degree Celsius to fall asleep and stay asleep. And it's the reason that you'll always find it easier
That's everyone.
That's everyone.
Yeah.
And it's the reason you'll always find it easier to fall asleep in a room that's too cold than too hot, because too cold is taking you in the right temperature direction. So your body needs to be cool and colder than it normally is at night for good sleep. And this is why menopause, in part, is so problematic for sleep, because the body goes into these sort of hormonal mismatches where you create an increase in body temperature, you get night sweats, and that actually is taking you away from the correct thermal sort of regiment in your body to get good sleep. So people can start to play around with thinner sheets on the bed. They can use a fan that sits next to them to try and actually cool them down as well. And then also just going to speak to your GP potentially about hormone replacement therapy. A lot of women typically find that they sleep better once they are sort of engaged with HRT.
And these kind of questions that I'm coming up with, the kind of dark deprived and light deprived and the menopausal sleep, is this the kind of thing that you sit down with your team of researchers and say, right, let's do some experiments around this?
We're led, I would say, by both of those hands. On the one hand, we read a lot of the scientific literature and we're sort of right on the cutting edge there, and then we try to think about the next studies based on the science that's coming out. But then I think one of the dangers, if that's all you do as a scientist, is that you tend to forget practically what is happening outside in society. And there are critical societal questions that you have to address with sleep science, not just basic science questions. And so I think one of the wonderful gifts that's been given to me over the past 2 years with the book coming out and doing a lot of public work is that you hear a lot from the public. You get questions like this, you get radio sort of call-ins and phone call-ins, and you start to realize that there are huge societal sleep questions that you need to solve and figure out. And so we're starting to look at those too. A good example here is night owls and morning larks. So there's a thing called your chronotype, and everyone has a chronotype. Are you a morning type? Are you an evening type? Are you somewhere in between? So evening types, they tend to like to go to bed at maybe 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning, wake up at 10 or 11 in the morning. Morning types, they tend to like to go to bed maybe 9 o'clock in the evening, wake up at 5. And then most of us, or a third of the rest of the population, is somewhere in between that. Now, what are the consequences? Because society is pushed into favoring morning types. The early bird catches the worm. We reinforce people who are early into work in the morning. We think they're hard workers. So we don't reward the evening types. And in fact, if anything, we sort of stigmatize them as being slothful and lazy because they come into work a little late despite working later usually. What's the societal impact there on those people? Are the evening types more resilient to sleep deprivation, for example? Because they like to sort of, they can stay awake for longer into the evening. Should the evening types be more of the types that we see working in emergency rooms or doctors or pilots? Or are morning types who like to go to bed very early, do they suffer far more from those types of jobs that require them from working into the night? Now, we would never have thought about answering those types of fundamental questions if I hadn't been out speaking to people about these things. So we are served by both of those scions, as it were.
How do you work out your type? Because I think I'm quite good if I get up early, but I also like to stay up quite late at night, so I can't work out which type I am.
So if you were to go onto a desert island and it's just you, no commitments whatsoever, you don't have to wake up for anything, for anybody, what time do you think you would typically drift to then go into bed and wake up?
Early.
So you think you would be going to bed a little bit earlier than you typically do?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So then that's a great way for people to sort of figure out their chronotype. Yeah. Just say, if I was devoid of all of the responsibilities and all of the vagaries of sort of modern society, my work schedule and sort of my family life, and what would be my natural tendency? And most people typically know it. Now, if you want, you can go online and you can do something called the Morningness Eveningness Questionnaire, or the MEQ. if you want to really be, maniacal, you can do that. You can figure out precisely what type you are. Are you a morning type, somewhere in between, or an evening type? But that's the best way that I can sort of suggest people figure out that question. The other question that typically comes up in that regard is, how do I know if I'm getting enough sleep? And the answer, probably one of them, is if you're setting an alarm to wake up and the alarm didn't go off, would you keep sleeping? And if the answer is yes, you're not getting enough sleep.
Yeah. And what about you? Are you a morning type or an evening type?
I am somewhere in between. What's one of the interesting things is that no matter what type you are, it changes across your lifespan. So as children, we're typically all kind of morning types. We go to bed early, and to the annoyance of our parents, we wake up early. But then as you go through those teenage years, you're actually fast-forwarded in time. And teenagers would actually have a biological sort of determined predilection for going to sleep probably around midnight or 1 a.m. and waking up closer to sort of, 11:30, 12. Now, we don't let them sleep like that because of school start times. And it's not their fault. It's not their choice. They don't get to decide. It's hardwired into their genetic, biological circadian rhythm. But then as we start to move into adult life, that sort of timing starts to come back a little bit. Rather than liking to go to bed at 1 a.m., we then start to sort of say midnight and then 11. And then as you get into older age, you kind of regress back almost to childhood, where you're going to bed, typically earlier than you would do in your 40s, and certainly than you did do in your 20s. So everyone changes throughout their lifespan, but across individuals, from one individual to the next, there is huge variability in that chronotype.
So what time's your bedtime?
So I would typically go to bed around sort of 10 o'clock, and I usually wake up around sort of 6:30. So I try to give myself a non-negotiable 8 to 8.5 hour sleep opportunity. And the reason I do that is several reasons. The first is that most people don't realize that not everyone has a perfect sleep efficiency. And what I mean by that is, how much of the time that you are in bed are you asleep? And most people, if you're a good sleeper, you'll have a sleep efficiency of about 85% or more, meaning that 85% of the time that you're in bed, you're asleep. 15% of the time you're awake. So if you want to get, 8 hours of sleep, which is, if you do the math, I think it's 460 minutes of sleep, and you lose, 10% of that because of inefficiency, then you're going to need to be in bed for at least 8.5 to 8.75 hours to get your full 8 hour of sleep total. So that's why I think people, when they say, well, I go to bed at midnight and I wake up at 7, so I've had 7 hours of sleep. That's not true. You're probably much closer to having maybe just 6 hours and 10 minutes.
And I see you've got an Oura ring on there, haven't you? And I've got one as well. And that's you realise that, don't you? If you're wearing a tracker, for a start, it always thinks it takes me 20 minutes, half an hour to go to sleep.
Yeah.
And if you get up to go to the loo in the middle of the night, that's another 20, 30 minutes out as well.
Yeah, and I think, the important point right now is these sleep trackers aren't 100% accurate. I think, I like the Oura Ring for a number of reasons, but none of them are perfect. None of them are anywhere near as precise as my sleep laboratory right now. Will we get there in 2 to 4 years' time? I think we probably will do, through different form factors. And I like the Ring as a form factor rather than a wristwatch, and I think there are other form factors that we can use. But the point is this, I think, don't worry too much about what it's telling you for deep sleep or light sleep or REM sleep. They're actually somewhat accurate for tracking total sleep time and time awake. Time awake may be a little bit more inaccurate. So I wouldn't get too anxious. I think they're a good barometer, though, generally. And I would say that in medicine, what we typically refer to as, what gets measured gets managed, is a good thing. And once you start to track your sleep, you become more aware of it. You want to try and improve it. You want to try and, increase it. You then start to see trends. For example, if you go out and you have a few beers at night or a couple of glasses of wine, you will typically see that your dream sleep gets abolished in the late night, and your deep sleep isn't as deep anymore.
Or even eating late.
Eating late will do it, because
that definitely changes everything.
Yeah. We typically say, try not to go to bed too hungry, but try not to go to bed too full. usually sort of 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed is a good time to sort of cut food off. You can, if you really need to, have just a very light snack, but typically don't sort of have something that's going to sit heavy in your stomach.
Yeah. Do you look much into food? I mean, one of the interesting things with the Oura Ring is it also tells you your heart rate and your heart rate variability.
Yeah.
And certainly mine is highly, everything is affected by eating later and a really heavy meal at night. And I can see that it takes my heart rate ages to drop throughout the night. And I think it affects my sleep as well. Is that something that, I mean, do you kind of geek out on that, or you just think, oh, I've got better gear in the lab?
No, I do use it, and I do sort of look at the intercorrelation. You know, if you're as geeky as me, that Oura has, and I don't have any relationship with the ring company, they have an API, which means that you can sort of scrape your data in minuscule detail, and then you can create spreadsheets. And if you're like me as a scientist, you start to collide everything together, and you add additional metrics like food and mood and, you know, anxiety and exercise, and you can see how they all interact, and it's great. But yeah, the other thing is that if I really want an effective sleep test on me, then I just go into my sleep lab and have one done on myself. That's the beauty of it. Yeah.
So something that I've asked everybody on this podcast, and you've kind of already dealt with it, but I ask people to recommend a book that they like and a tip for living with more energy and vitality. You've already said that there wasn't anything out there quite right, which is why you wrote your book. Is there, I mean, I can highly vouch for your book. I very much enjoyed it. And one of the biggest compliments a lot of people have said is that they very much enjoy reading your book, and it also does send them off to sleep at night.
That's excellent. Flattery is a great thing.
Exactly. But what is another book that you would recommend? Is there anything kind of in your studies that you thought would be a good thing to recommend?
Well, I wonder actually if I can be a bit contrarian and go outside of science. One of the books that I read recently that had a real impact on me was by a neuroscientist and sort of philosopher, a guy called Sam Harris, who has a podcast and is sort of out there in the world, is a great thought leader. And he wrote a book, a very short book called Lying.
I read it.
And it's a great book.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic book that sort of teaches us the downside to even the smallest of white lies, that once you start down that path, it's a very slippy slope. And there's something incredibly freeing about being honest. You don't have to be brutally honest. You can be kindly honest, but you have to be honest nonetheless. And there is an incredible freedom that comes when you sort of break the shackles and sort of the bondage of lying, because it sets you into this sort of vicious cycle of then having to lie to catch up on lies. And also, it's not just that it helps other people better understand you, but you end up being better understood by other people. And your life just ends up being a lot easier and a lot less stressful as a consequence. It's hard to do, but once you get into the practice, it's a little bit like meditation, you know. It's a great thing once you get there, but to sort of get into it can sometimes be hard to make it stick. And, you know, being honest in this day and age is a little bit of a social faux pas, sadly, because we're all sort of trying to be too mindful of other, you know, political correctness and all of those things. So I would recommend that book if you just want, and it's a very short, you could read it in an afternoon or a day, or listen to it, you know, within a couple of hours on a audio book, just to provoke yourself into thinking about that. You don't necessarily have to start it as a practice, but just to be provoked by the idea is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's a while ago I read that. What do you think about the there's a philosophical bit in the second part where he's kind of almost every objection to always telling the truth he tries to deal with, and there are some and you think, in this situation I definitely would lie.
Yeah, and there's some really brutal sort of
like
examples.
Someone knocks on your door with an axe. Are you going to lie and tell them that the person they're looking for isn't there?
Right.
Or are you going to tell them the truth?
Yeah. And he just systematically goes through, as is his, you know, brilliance and genius, dismantling every argument that you can think of as to why a lie in that situation surely is permissible. But no, it's not.
Yeah. And then one tip for living with more energy and vitality, since that's the kind of principal topic of this podcast.
So, you know, I think sleep is the single most effective thing you can do to reset your brain and body health. there's nothing like it. It is the greatest health insurance policy that you could ever wish for, and it's democratic. It's largely free and mostly available to many people. I know there are people who struggle with sleep and it's not always available to them, but for the most part it is. And in terms of, a doctor's recommendation, it's not a particularly bitter pill to swallow. There's nothing quite like, at the end of the day, getting into bed and having a good long sleep. My book, rather than being called Why We Sleep, there was one moment where I wanted to call it Consciousness is Overrated, but the publisher thought better of it and renamed it. But I would have to finish with that. Yeah,
that's excellent. And I really love the book. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And the final question: your bedroom, is it completely 100% blacked out?
It is pretty much. I have blackout curtains. I don't wear a face mask at home, I have to say, because there is not much light pollution there at night, and I've got some pretty good blackout curtains. So it's basically cave-like is what we recommend.
You go around with bits of tape covering over the standby button.
I'm not quite that sort of maniacal about it, but certainly I will make sure that there aren't too many seams of curtain, not occluding the window.
Yeah. Matt, listen, thanks so much. The book is Why We Sleep, and we are coming to see you tonight, talk at the Emmanuel Centre. It's an interview, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I'll give some short remarks, a couple of slides, a bit of science at the start, and then we'll have a long discussion. But thank you for taking the time to do this, because I am on a mission to try to reunite humanity with the sleep that it is so desperately bereft of at this moment in time. But I can't do that by myself. I need wonderful sort of journalists and public health advocates to come out and help me with that. So my thanks actually go to you. I'm going to anoint you as a sleep ambassador now as well for carrying this message. Yeah. So thank you so much, Tony. Yeah.
Well, that's almost it for today's Zestology. I'm still here in West London, and it's a pretty wet summer's day, to be honest. You can probably hear the rain falling on the trees. Can you hear that? Just about. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed Matt Walker's interview. It was I was really excited to go and meet him, and then we went to his presentation afterwards. He did a presentation at the Emmanuel Centre in central London, and I learnt even more stuff, and I just kind of went home totally inspired by the chance to spend a bit of time with such an expert and such a nice guy as well. And then having gone to his presentation and just been reminded about the benefits of good sleep and the perils of bad sleep, I just felt really inspired by it all. So I hope you do as well. I have got other sleep interviews in the Zestology archives. If you either head to tonywrighton.com and type the word sleep into the search box, then you'll find all the old podcasts that have got sleep as a topic in them, or look for Zestology and Dr. Michael Bruce, who's excellent as well, and Nick Littlehales, who is the Real Madrid and Manchester United sleep coach. So both of them are interesting on sleep as well. I had to say though, I think Matt Walker's probably my new number one when it comes to sleep, and I hope you enjoyed that as well. Well, coming up soon on Zestology, I'm excited about some of the interviews that I've got planned. Hard to top Matt Walker, but I think we might be able to do it in the future, or at least equal the quality of Matt Walker. Brett Moran coming up very shortly. That's next week on Zestology. Brett Moran in Thailand, friend of the show, master meditator, and so much more to him as well. He's coming up next week, so see you then. And in the meantime, have a zesty week.